Okay, well, everybody, we're going to get started this evening. The session is being recorded, so hopefully you all got that message and everybody's fine with that. I'm sure you are. Welcome, and I'm so glad to have you here. Just a little bit about myself. So my name is Marlena Giroux, and I am the president of Howard County Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation. We are a newly formed nonprofit. And when we came into the arena, looking at not only history activity that was going on historically in Howard County, but also taking a look at the culture and the environment, so to speak, in Howard County back at the time when these activities were going on, we kind of discovered that and walked into, quite by accident, I guess, or by divine order, however you want to see it, we stepped into a situation where we didn't really find the history that we were looking for, that we thought that we were going to need in order to really be able to do our job effectively. And so we started creating and generating content. And when we started generating the content, we were experiencing some resistance. And so, as in most things, when you're encountering a problem and you're trying to find a solution to it, sometimes you look and you try to find, well, the way that I say it, you try to find your tribe. You try to find people that can help, and people who, when you don't understand what's going on, you look for others. And so it was my utter delight to be able to stumble into and find that there was a wonderful conference that was going on. That as soon as I took a look at the programming for the Slave Dwelling Projects Conference, I was just mesmerized and amazed by the panelists and the speakers and all the various topics. And so that is what brought me to the conference that was going on about changing the narrative. And so there was one session in particular, however, that when I was watching it, I must confess I haven't even watched all of the sessions yet still, because it was just that wonderful. I came across one in particular. There were many, but one in particular that really just caused me to pause and just think like, wow, and everything. And I just knew that the place where I lived in Howard County could benefit from having this information. And I was banking on that other people would feel the same way as well. I think we all know that as adults, sometimes change is uncomfortable for people. It's kind of jarring when you encounter resistance, especially when you're living in a place that considers itself and always says it's so diverse and a melting pot and this and that. And I, for one, just couldn't understand why there would be resistance in the year 2021. And from people who have always had the microphone, that's what I call them, but so it was. So I approached the Slave Dwelling Project about being able to televise. It was just my idea at first to can I just share it with some people in our community? And they were gracious enough to be able to not only allow us to do that, but up the ante and said, yeah, so we can do this for you and do that for you. We can bring Jeannie in too from Solderly and Historic Solderly and so forth. And the ball went running from there. And so welcome to that event. That is this event. And so without any further ado, I would like to now turn it over to Joe McGill, the thing from the Slave Dwelling Project. Joe?
Hello, and thank you for giving the introduction and laying it out beautifully of why you exist, how you exist, resistance. Yes, my name is Joseph McGill, and I am the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. We are in our 11th year of existence. From an idea that still exists today. It's rooted in finding slave dwellings wherever they are in the United States and spending nights in these places. This simple act has gotten me into places, presidential sites, National Park Service sites, privately owned sites, but more importantly than that, we have evolved into conversations around a campfire. Sleeping at these historic sites is easy, and it's appealing. And folks were indulging in that, and we still are, on a more limited basis due to COVID. But we now take more advantage of the opportunity to have conversations before the sleepover, usually around a campfire, talking about subject matter such as white supremacy, historical trauma, white privilege, the death of George Floyd, uh, Confederate monuments, should they stay, should they go? Should we eliminate images such as Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, and things of this nature? We talk about these things. Weddings on plantations. We talk about all these things around a campfire. We deal with that, and we usually around a campfire with people we don't know. We just met these folks at this event, and all of these folks don't look like you or think like you. So this makes for an interesting conversation, and that's what we do. But the conference is even more in depth. It gives us the opportunity to bring in scholars and site managers and site representatives and archaeologists and genealogists. And we all exist in this one place at this conference, um, in this dedicated time. And it's certainly a pleasure to be a part of the opportunity to have a sleepover at Sodderly very early on in the slave dwelling project existence. We called on Sodderly, or they called on us, so we found each other. And very early on, I had the opportunity to spend the night in the slave dwelling at Sodderly. I spent the second night in the big house. So I've been there at least 3 times. I think one time was just for a presentation, maybe, but it was my pleasure to do that. So that's generally what we do. We find slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States, and we spend nights in these spaces to bring attention to them in honor of the ancestors, always in honor of the ancestors. And having the opportunity to apply that at Solidly was a good thing. I know the invitation is open. So with that, I'll yield to the next presenter, Jeannie.
Hello, everyone, and I'm honored and humbled to be here. And thank you to Marlena, Joe, Nicole, and Corey for making this possible tonight. And it was definitely my honor and privilege to be a part of the conference and to be here tonight. And just in case you've never been to historic Sodderly, it is in Southern Maryland in St. Mary's County. It's on the Western Shore, not the Eastern Shore. And it's about 60 miles from DC and about 120 miles from Richmond. So it seems far away for some of you folks, but it's not really that far. And there's lots to do in St. Mary's County. So come down and see us soon. And I met Joe in 2011. I had been at Sodderly. That was my second year. So I was green, and I learned a lot from Joe and a lot of my other mentors, and just over the years. And Sodderly went through a reinterpretation that I'll explain in the presentation. So I've been been around the block on this a few times, and so hopefully it'll be of help to you. And we have a wonderful descendants program. So and some of them are out in the audience today. So welcome everybody. And I will turn it over to the next person in charge here.
Got you covered. All right, everybody, we are going to watch this. Please, in the chat, if there are any technical issues, just let us know and we will do our best to manage that. Thank you and have a good evening.
So let's get started. So the peaceful transfer of power, understanding, overcoming resistance to changing the narrative. So I am Jeannie Pirtle. I am the Director of Educational Programs and Partnerships for Historic Sodderly
which is a museum in St. Mary's County, Maryland. Um, I've been there for 11 years. So I've been in many meetings, trainings, seminars, and other programming events over the years. And when discussing the ideas of a diverse and inclusive narrative about interpreting slavery, history, and systemic racism, I mentioned the subject of power as being behind the fear of changing the narrative. People often balk at that notion, but the fear of losing control of the historical narrative is based on the fear of losing the power over the narrative. Today, I will discuss the problem, the pain, the patience, the persistence, the progress, and the peace to help those who are working to change the narrative and those resistant to this change, as well as helping us with understanding this resistance in ourselves and others. And just a disclaimer, no organization, including mine, has arrived. So the power problem. I remember years ago attending a presentation by Nicole Moore, and many of you know Nicole. She is actually a part of this conference this weekend. She was telling of her experiences as a living history interpreter at a historic site of slavery. She explained that if there was any visitor who had questions about slavery or the enslaved, all the other white interpreters would guide them to her. She explained how this bothered her. She said to the audience, "It's everyone's responsibility to tell this story." I can say I really took this to heart, and she was so right. But little did I know what a personal and professional challenge this would be. As a white woman, I'm still learning, and this is a lifelong process. I was hired on at Historic Southerly in Hollywood, Maryland in August of 2010, over 11 years ago. They had just received a grant to do a reinterpretation. I was green, and although I came from an education and social science background, I really knew very little about Southerly's history and how long and complex it really was. It has changed my life. I made lots of observations and learned along the way. Southerly is a site of slavery. The museum was founded in the early 1960s by the granddaughter of J.P. Morgan. Its land was inhabited by native peoples thousands of years before 1699, when what would later become known as Southerly began with the purchase of land on the Patuxent River. And settled by a wealthy Englishman who was an agent for the Royal African Company. Hi, Meredith. I got distracted. One of my good friends and mentors just showed up. A border, a generation's owners followed. Okay, so slavery was a part of Southerly's history from its inception. A border state during the Civil War, emancipation did not come until 1864. Racism, Jim Crow, segregation were all part of Southerly's and Maryland's story. The better part of Southerly's museum history, Southerly interpreted a male, Eurocentric narrative. Two events. The first, Agnes Kane Callum from Baltimore entered Morgan State University in her 40s. During her research, she found her family's connection to Southerly. Her ancestor had been enslaved there in the 19th century. She brought her family in the early 1970s to Southerly and worked tirelessly to have her family's story told. Reading her oral history, she says, "When I visited," she means Southerly, "and they knew I was coming, when I had left would be displayed, but when I came unannounced, it was not." She did not give up and even joined with the descendant of her ancestor's slaveholder to save Southerly from extinction. That was 25 years ago. The second event was the reinterpretation mentioned earlier that began in 2009, 2010. With reinterpretation began was a concerted effort to find a more accurate history and one with more stories of more people, particularly the stories of the enslaved women and children, those who held the least power, which all were eager to begin and learn the stories. Resistance started to come, however, when integrating these stories. Slaveholders were held in high esteem by themselves and their peers during their time. The realization that no longer would a visitor hear only the owner's perspective on what kind of slaveholder he or she was and why he was a slaveholder met some resistance. It would now also be perceived through the eyes or perspectives of the people that they enslaved. No longer would the slaveholder totally control the narrative. No longer would phrases like, "that's just the way it was back then," "he was a kind master," "slavery is never kind," "if it was so bad, why did they stay?" "they were better off," "he really didn't want to own slaves." All this doesn't hold any water anymore. Those would no longer hold any weight because these are from the slaveholder's perspective and those that benefited and continue to benefit from the legacies of racial chattel slavery. The fact that people not only survive but thrive culturally and spiritually despite their enslavers is brought to light. Another one I hear from some historians even, we can't tell what he, the slaveholder, believed felt. I find that if I read primary documents that you bought and sold people, you sold away their family members, you joined a vigilante group, you did everything in your power to preserve the institution of slavery, you tried to get reparations for lost property at every turn, I pretty much can tell how you felt about slavery. The problems are many: the lack of compassion, ignorance of truthful history, the fear of acceptance and changing what you've always believed, the realization that you have benefited from white privilege, of being the default group, the possibility that you yourself have been complicit, and the greatest fear of giving up power over the historical narrative, all are great obstacles to overcome. In museums, historic sites, and other nonprofits, diversity is different than equity. You can have some people of color on your board, but that does not necessarily mean the power has shifted. Just like most things in the US, power is governance and who has the purse strings. If we supply grants, we have power to make the rules on who gets the grants. If you have a descendants group, who decides the rules for being part of the group? Do they have any input or control over interpretation? Are they segregated? Are your stories within your interpretation still segregated? Do you separate African American history tours instead of embedding it in all your exhibits, tours, and programs? Is the African American interpreter the only one talking about slavery and the enslaved? Do you and your museum staff and board participate in equity assessments and training? And the last frontier, does development, of course, development is the fundraising part of a nonprofit or any organization. Does it cater to or promise to those that will support, but only support their way? Okay. Are they on board with an inclusive narrative? One story I'll tell about a development. So when we do brochures, and we were doing development brochures, and there was pictures on this for a campaign, and there was one of my favorite pictures that we have was an African American woman at one of our middle passage ceremonies that we had in 2012, and outstretched hand over the water, beautiful dress, just a striking picture, just a striking moment. Well, we heard things like, where to put this picture and putting on the front did not go forward. It was put back some because I've heard comments from people that, want to support, think they want to support, but they'll ask questions like, so you don't only talk about African Americans, do you? Um, so they need some education on what they're supporting. And the answer should be, our stories are diverse. Our stories are from multiple perspectives. But it's always amazing to me how eons, um, the only narrative is a white Eurocentric narrative, and that when you start including and embedding these stories, that you get that fear that somehow the white narrative is going to be lost. So development is one of the last frontiers in a museum because money is a big deal, especially in a nonprofit. Okay, so the pain. When I listen to mixed groups of people that descend from slaveholders and the enslaved, I hear a common thread. Everyone has felt pain when coming to grips with the truthful telling of this history. Descendants of enslaved have lived the harsh legacies of this history, and most carry generational trauma. They have experienced racism, both in microaggressions and blatant acts and words. They often feel a range of emotions, from anger about what their ancestors endured to inspiration at the resilience of their ancestors. There is also the complication that some are also descendants of the same slaveholders that held their people in bondage. Yet another legacy. So deep is the legacy embedded in our government and social systems that were established on the basis that people not of white Western European descent were inferior and not equal. Those of us who are white, we seem fragile when confronted with the reality of our own history. And of course, most people probably in this audience have heard of the book White Fragility. The chapter on white women's tears really kicked my rear. Okay, but if you haven't read it, please do. Our friends of color grow weary of explaining and defending as they wait for what should be the obvious compassionate response. Our faith, often used to justify our wrongdoing, ironically sustain the spirits of those in bondage. We whites like to blame others for these injustices instead of accepting the truth of our combined history. We refuse to hear the history, or worse, deny others from learning their history. We become confused or even angry when we are lumped in a group. This is because whites see themselves as individuals and categorize others in groups. Therefore, white people don't understand why Black people don't agree on how to solve problems or don't respond the same way. We still see others as a group instead of realizing that each person is an individual. The patience. I often hear people in museums or change groups lament about, why didn't more people of color attend, or why don't more people of color volunteer? Like, if we build it, they will come thing. Well, using Sodderly as an example, although I believe lots of museums have a similar story, Sodderly was a site of slavery that is open to the public. There are sites of slavery, but few are a place that dares to interpret history or is public. But like most places, museums told the same white-centric narrative unless it was specifically a museum for and about other ethnic or racial groups. Sodderly, the nonprofit museum, was created 60 years ago. Schools were still segregated. Churches were segregated, or seating was segregated. People and families were still working there, and some of their fathers and grandfathers were not allowed in the house or surrounding yard. Some had been sharecroppers that still remembered those who had been emancipated in 1864. There was generational bitterness towards Sodderly. Still, there are some who won't venture there. Their story was not really told there, so why should they trust us when we decide we're going to change the narrative? We haven't earned that trust. Earning trust takes time. People must believe and then trust that you're for real. This takes building relationships. Building honest relationships takes time. Building relationships is good, but most important, you must give up power. Museums can be elitist places. People need and must tell their own stories. This is one of the hardest obstacles to overcome in museums. I see this with oral history. First, it has just recently become okay in recent years in the museum world to seriously count oral history of people of color as part of historical record. I always thought it funny that we love to hear made up stories of pirates, but an oral history from a Black person was suspect. Someone made up rules for how you do an oral interview, and who was that? Who made up the rules? And that's a question you have to ask for most operations and interpretation in a museum. Who made up those rules? Okay. How about just let people tell their story? Oh, it may not be totally in agreement with other interviews. It may have a misremembered name or date, but a serious historian will always use more than one source. So these perceived problems should not be problems. What you want is an oral history. In an oral history is the essence of the person, their heart, their feelings, their insights, their experiences, their perspective. And please, the interviewer should not be talking more than the one being interviewed. It also is important to not have a power disparity between interviewer and interviewee. In other words, they need to be able to trust you. A word of warning: whenever there is grant money, the smell of support, fame, any of those things, this work can become exploitative very easily. Check your motives daily, individually and institutionally. Why am we doing this? The founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, Carter G. Woodson, son of former slaves, was the second Black man to earn his PhD from Harvard in 1912. He was considered the father of Black history. He first established Black History Week, which corresponded with the birthdays of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. This later became Black History Month. It is in this month the organization announces the theme of study for the year. Never intended to be the only month of the year to study Black history, only the first of 12. But this too can be abused as the token month that Black history is studied or remembered. Woodson himself said, and I'm using quotes from the article that I got this from. Woodson himself complained about the intellectual charlatans, Black and white, popping up everywhere, seeking to take advantage of the public interest in Black history. He warned teachers not to invite speakers who had less knowledge than the students themselves. Interestingly, publishing houses that had previously ignored Black topics and authors rushed to put books on the market and in schools. Instant experts appeared everywhere, and non-scholarly works appeared from mushroom presses. In America, nothing popular escapes either commercialization or eventual trivialization. So Woodson had his hands full in promoting celebrations worthy of the people who made the history. And that was by Daryl Michael Scott. The persistence. This is a lifetime of work. It never ends. Sometimes there is joy and often despair. It doesn't take many years for a whole generation to forget its history. People who forget become easy prey for misinformation. They can lose their sense of belonging, their sense of perseverance. The goal in education is to promote critical thinking, being able to see an issue from multiple perspectives, being able to do self-assessment and how and if to apply this knowledge, being able to relate knowledge learned from the past and see real relevance to the present without falling for logical fallacies. This learning through multiple and diverse perspectives also creates compassion and empathy for others. Beware, the enemy of equity is very clever. It often disguises itself under another name. It may become a buzzword to instill fear of ideas or change. It loves to make you focus inward instead of reaching outward. It promotes ignorance, blame, and distrust, sometimes violence and death. It numbs or kills the conscience to murder compassion. It gives a false sense of security. It destroys lives, communities, even countries. When you tell, just a word of experience, when you tell this history of change after you're a site that hasn't done so, you will lose people in the process. You'll lose teachers, docents, board members, employees, even. And that could instill fear. Oh, we're losing people. Well, just know that when you change this narrative, you will. Okay. People, your teachers and docents will have to be better trained because this is a complicated history. You have to have some finesse. You have to know where to touch people where they are to bring them forward. People have to trust us in the community, trust you, that you can tell the story, trust your organization, that you can tell their story and you're going to do it accurately and fairly and completely. Okay. For museums, you can't let ignorance stand. A tour where you can tell they want to hear the. Sometimes I know that they're there sincerely, is purposefully, and they want to hear the story, but still, they might go. They might expose some fear, and say something like my ancestors got there before slavery, so how's this affect me? So once again, they don't realize that there's nobody safe. There is nobody that isn't affected. So so you have to meet them where they are, and I think the best way to do this is to kindly ask them to explain what they mean by what they just said. What do you mean by that? I find that a lot of people just say the stuff and they don't even think about, they don't hear themselves. They don't think about what they're saying. It's just something they've heard said or something they always say, and they haven't really given it much thought. But when you ask people to explain what they mean, sometimes they can't do it. And then it gives you a segue into the discussion. Well, if everyone benefited from the institution of slavery and racism, that wasn't everybody except the enslaved, right, benefited from it, and long after it was over, right, the legacy of slavery. So I find that is a very good technique to use. If you use it too often, though, people catch on. Oh, she's going to, watch what I say. She's going to ask me a question, right? She's going to ask me to explain myself. So you can't overdo that all at the same time, like all through your tour. But sometimes, I believe in the visitor experience. You should want to come there and want to experience it. But what I do also is before I start any kind of program or tour, I make sure I mention that we were a site of slavery from the very beginning, and all our owners during slavery unapologetically were slaveholders. So I say that right off the bat, so you're not surprised. So I don't go through. They know, the visitor now knows this is going to be part of the tour. So I don't wait until I get almost done to say that. I start that at the very beginning. That's one of the first things I say. So helping to embed that in uh, all of your tours and all of your presentations. Okay, so the progress. Major social change is slow moving. It takes a lifetime, sometimes several. Our history bears this out. Women's vote in 1920. What took so long? Chattel slavery for centuries, and some forms of slavery still exist. But change can and does happen. It happens at a slow pace, though. Sometimes we are so in the struggle, it is hard to see the progress. And if not diligent, we can backslide and repeat mistakes we could have learned from our study of the past. It's all about the legacy we leave, the people we have influenced, taught, and mentored. Do you leave the next generation with the tools they need, the skills to survive and thrive, a more equitable and compassionate world? Um, the peace. Um, oh, yeah, did I say peace? I really can't think of too many well known people that lived for peace that were not met with strong resistance or even violence. This work takes courage to face hardship, to risk losing friends in high places, to stand up for someone in the workplace or school that is being mistreated at your workplace. You might take verbal abuse, being called a radical, an extremist, brainwashed, disloyal, and that's just from your own relatives, right? Some of that's from your own relatives, even people that are very close to you, um, uh, and and then the community. Um, so wear it as a badge of honor. If somebody calls you a radical or something like that, use it as a badge of honor. You must be doing something right, okay? Because I've been called a radical from someone that was recommended to be a docent, but they didn't do it because my radical view about slavery, my radical interpretation about slavery, and using mine. See, people like to point to people like it's me. They don't think about this is the way the institution is doing it, right? But that's my job, because uh, I'm that person, the programming person, the education person, the person that helps with training people. And but the story really came from a whole group of people. It was a long process, but this is the kind of stuff, okay, that you're going to uh, confront. And I'm just saying, wear it as a badge of honor. You might have people play their privilege card, right? You might have someone, oh, I donated, uh, $10,000, so I don't have to listen to this. You might have to turn down money. I mean, think of that. Can you imagine a nonprofit turning down money? That would be a real act of courage. Say that the donor, they want it used for everything, but it can't support the diverse narrative. They don't want you talking about Black people. Are you going to turn down the money? Okay, that's where the real test lies, isn't it? It's really hard to do in a nonprofit world. You might face danger standing up for someone else's human rights. You might have to listen more than you talk. Take the initiative to learn yourself. Don't have people of color show you what to do. Study, listen, learn, take training, build some honest mentor relationships. And then when you do that, then you can have honest conversations with your mentors and those close to you that can help guide you. And you can ask those difficult questions and trust that you'll get an honest answer. So some of my mentors, Ann Chin and Ann Cobb from Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. I have several mentors that are in this work from St. Mary's College of Maryland, our local college. Meredith Taylor here on the chat is one of those people. So that's, it's annoying when you just throw up your hands and say, show me how to do this. You have to take initiative, right? Be open, keep your heart open and your mind open. You will always catch yourself thinking in new ways. You will also catch yourself messing up sometimes. That, oh, wait, I didn't think of it that way. Forgive yourself. Admit that, yes, this is something I need to address, and move on. Okay. There is always hope. Keep working.
All right, let me stop sharing and invite our speakers to come back on screen. All right, I will turn it back over to you all.
Great. That was beautiful, Jeannie. I got to look at it for the first time this past weekend, and I thought it was impressive that you could pull that all together. One of two presentations that you did at the past conference, changing narratives. So yes, the peaceful transfer of power, understanding and overcoming resistance to inclusive perspectives of history. Jeannie, you've covered a lot of ground on the issue. The problem, the elephant in the room, the fact that there is pushback to changing the narrative, and I experienced it on pretty much on a daily basis when I work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, because more recently working as a tour guide on the front line, just as you do, you're in the trenches. You hear the folks, you can see the folks, those that can receive the message and receive it well, and then there are those who give pushback. And so I think a part of why this pushback to this narrative change is, as you talked about, controlling of that narrative. And that narrative has been controlled and included, white males, and it's embedded in our history, because the Declaration of Independence, 41 signers of that document were, slaveholders, slave owners. 25 signers of the Constitution were slave owners, and 12 of our former presidents were slave owners. So all that control and all the privileges that came with that, that's all now being challenged with the changing of the narrative. And that is coupled with the fact that this narrative, this white male narrative, is also combating the fact that in the future, maybe not my lifetime, but some of the younger folks listening and tuning into this, maybe in your lifetime, that that demographic shift is going to take place. And that demographic shift will mean that the majority will be the minority. I mean, there'll be a minority in more people who look like them than the majority will consist of, because the majority will consist of a conglomeration of people with different ethnicities. It's more diverse. It's more people looking differently and thinking differently that are now going to be the majority. So there's pushback to that. There's resistance, and part of that resistance is telling the story, telling the history of this nation, because we are a great nation. But in becoming this great nation, we've committed some atrocities along the way that we want to, we don't want our young children to learn about. And they disguise it as was so well stated by Jeannie in these buzzwords or these isms or these acronyms are, they throw these words together: critical race theory, who some can't define, but they use that as their rallying point to muster people into these frenzies of history, or supporting some type of history that continues to support the white male narrative. So, we push back, at the Slave Dwelling Project. I push back on a daily basis when I'm interpreting at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, and Jeannie she pushes back in her way. She's part of our effort tonight to address you in the matter of the peaceful transfer of power, understanding and overcoming resistance, to inclusive perspectives of history. So we have our ways of dealing with that pushback that we get, and we also have our ways of furthering the effort of supporting these places that are all inclusive, like Sauterley and in various other places that I've visited in the past. So I'll pass, and I think we may have some questions and answers that we may want to address. So I'll yield right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. We do have questions in the Q&A. Marlena, did you want to lead that, or do you want me to do that?
Let's see. I can do it. That is fine. Let's see. The first one here from Karen. So it says, are you aware of towns or cities where museums have been able to exhibit true history that involves unsavory aspects of the ancestors of folks who still exert major control over those places? If so, how was that done?
Yeah, that's a deep question. Well, place, as I understood the first part of that question, the place that sprung out at me was Montgomery, in the lynching museum there. Of course, I think that's why part of the reason for this gathering tonight, in your affiliation with lynchings. So I know that in Montgomery, Alabama, they've got a very strong presence there, interpreting that aspect of our history. Can you read the second part of the question again, please?
Sure. And second says, well, it just says, if so, how was that done?
Well, it's that museum that exists, Brian Stevenson, took it upon himself as a gentleman dedicated to justice, equal justice, and taking on cases of people who were already convicted and in prison, and taking on those cases to prove that a lot of those cases that he took on, those folks were wrongfully convicted, and he obtained their freedom. And that's how he started out doing, gaining his. He started out gaining his fame, and he built on that. But in him building on that, he looked at the historical aspect of the justice system, and the fact that the justice system was had embedded within it systemic racism that was totally against the existence of Blacks, or mainly Black men, and the laws that were put in place to make them victims of crimes that you defined yourself as being a crime, such as after slavery ended shortly thereafter, you could get arrested for what they call loitering or vagrancy. In other words, if you are wandering in the streets and you get questioned, if you don't have a job, then for that reason, you could be put in jail and thrown into a chain gang. So when we look at the fact that slavery ended and the 13th Amendment came about, there were always those laws that kept that system of bondage in place. Mass incarceration, if you go back further than that, you see the patrols that patrol the countryside or wherever slavery existed. You see those patrols that would question any Black person not on the plantation. If you're not on the plantation, if you don't have a pass, you're a freedom seeker, you're a runaway. So there's that there is that history of that. So Bryan Stevenson was connecting these dots to not the problem existing right now in this time and space, because it does. That's obvious. But he was tracing the history of it, where it all started. So that's the genius of Bryan Stevenson. So he has it figured out.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I'm not going to go through the questions in order. I'm just going to jump around a little bit here. So everybody, please be patient with your questions. I will get to them. Here's one from Karen. It says, do you know of museums? I think this might be directed to Jeannie. Do you know of museums in towns or cities that are doing what you are doing despite having board members whose ancestors have been slavers or enslavers?
Well, at Sonnerly, we have a descendants project, and speak out there in the audience. Some of them are out there, but it's a little bit more unusual than a lot of places. Our descendants of the slaveholders and the descendants of the slaves are all in the same descendants group, so they do things together. And it's amazing, and it can be done, and it takes it takes time, it takes building trust, learning as we go. We've always had some descendants active, but we started a formal, what I call formal descendants project, where they actually register and identify as a descendant. And we don't make them, do DNA or any of that. Some of them have, but even if they think they might be, just because, we want to help them find their ancestor if we can, or confirm what they already know. Every person that comes on board as a descendant, and we do have descendants on the board too of both, so that's another thing. It's one thing to have a descendants project. Are any of them in leadership positions? Are they on the board? And then are they in positions of decision making with how things are interpreted, or how the money is earned and spent? That's really where the power lies. And we have pretty much all of those things, not perfectly, but we do, and it can be done. I know that is different than a lot of places, but it really makes it much more powerful, I think. And leave comments, those of you that I'm talking about, you know who you are, about your opinions on this subject. But it can be done, and it is powerful, and it's amazing. And it's, like I said in my presentation, this is a painful history for everyone. So it's painful to, and any of us, if we go back far enough, if our ancestors were in this country for, you know, at least for 2 centuries or so, you can, you know, you can find maybe not a large slave holding, but at least some. So none of us are immune. A lot of us aren't told some of our history. Like I have a Civil War history on both for my descendants, both of the Union and the Confederacy, but that Confederacy one was not passed down. I'm from a border state, Missouri. So it was not passed down to me. I had to find through genealogy, and my great-great-grandpa was named after Robert E. Lee. So when that hit me, that was, I went, what? So we all have, that, and I think when we find that we have that commonness, we have those same issues. I think it helps in healing. I really do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Another question here we have is, are you noticing more receptiveness to changing the narrative in younger people than in their parents?
Yes, I am. In fact, I comment about that in my presentation when I do my question and answer period, when I query the crowd, when I entice them into thinking about what's the number one question that I'm asked, and I give hints, and one of the hints that I give is that this number one question is asked by older white folks. And right then somebody will get it. They'll say, were the Draytons good slave owners? And that's the number one question. But I don't get that question from younger folks. They want to know, well, what are they in the paying reparations, in which I have to alert them to the fact that reparations is not an American thing. It wasn't, not for enslaved people. Reparations, when reparations were given in Washington D.C., it was given to the slave owners for loss of property. But the answer to the question is that the younger kids are better educated on this subject matter. I could tell by the questions that they ask. Where the profit's going now, and things of this nature. Whereas from an older audience is were the owners of this plantation good slave owners, or were they good to their enslaved people? So yeah, there's that difference.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. You've got a question here. Again, I'm skipping around here. There's a request, or do you have any comment on groups like Civil War Trails and others regarding are them helping or harming? And the first part of the question I will ask, they say, how has the National Park Service helped promote the history or restrict the history? For example, examples given, Gathland State Park in Maryland only tells Civil War history, and there's a lot left out. And so therefore no one really knows all of the history.
Well, somebody's got to take that on. Somebody's got to live and breathe it to make it so. And Jeannie talked about the fact that it's not going to be an overnight thing.
True.
I've been sleeping in slave dwellings for the last 11 years, guys, and there's still a lot of people out there that have no clue about the slave dwelling project of the purpose thereof. But you gotta that means you still gotta get to know them, or let them get to know you, and just keep doing what you're doing. But the National Park Service, as far as the slave dwelling project and its intent, I've slept at a few sites Kingsley Plantation in Jacksonville, Florida. Kingsley, the enslaver, had children with an enslaved woman. I imagine she was enslaved by, I'm sure she was, or because I don't think that they could be married at the time. I don't think that would have been recognized. But they had children together, and he left the plantation to her, and she continued to operate it as a plantation. I've stayed at the Booker T. Washington site. The first National Park Service I stayed at was in Louisiana. Magnolia Plantation in Louisiana was a cotton plantation. But yeah, the National Park Service is they're a good partner to the slave dwelling project. We do things together, and I'm partnering with an element of the National Park Service in our upcoming conference next year in September of next year. So yeah, so there is that relationship. Now, as far as the other Civil War trails, I think was mentioned, I don't know much about them or their purpose. So I can't speak on that.
Yes, Sotterley is on the Civil War trails because we interpret roughly 1699 to 1960. So border state. So the slaveholder, his sons went to the Confederacy. There was a 1st Maryland regiment in the CSA and Virginia, and then we had Union colored troops.
So
Washington, Briscoe. So and we had Medal of Honor winners from United States colored troops in St. Mary's County. So that's a big story in our county.
Okay, so here's a question. So here's a question for you, Jeannie. During the Civil War, did any enslaved people participate is a better word, in the Confederate efforts, as in building forts or anything of that? Were they leased out to the Confederate Army?
No, they basically they left to join Union colored troops, and they the slaveholder at the time of the Civil War, he kept a very low profile. You can't find anything on him in newspapers or anything during that time period. He is keeping a low profile. Because his sons are right across the river, right? So he, we have Point Lookout, which was they call it the Northern Andersonville. It was a prisoner of war camp for Confederate soldiers. So and it was run by Union colored troops.
Oh.
Yep. So so there's a big story down at Point Lookout. So we have more. That's a big story in St. Mary's County.
Okay.
Great. We've got someone who's going to be leaving shortly, I think, who would like a question to be asked. So I'm going to quickly ask their questions so that it can get asked and answered. And I believe, Jeannie, this will probably be for you too. How do descendants express themselves in the Sotterley program?
Hi, Trudy. Trudy is one of our descendants, and in our Common Ground programming, we do panels, and descendants do their own programming. Trudy did one for us where they tell their own stories. I mean, they tell their journeys, and I'm a people historian. I think buildings are great, and I think objects are great, but what does it have to do with the people? That's what I want to know. So that's the kind of historian I am. And so Donald Barber, Trudy. We've had the panel on several occasions now, and so they express themselves very well, and each person's experience is different. No experience is the same, and it's so educational and heartwarming to hear each person's struggle, and it's just invaluable. And then get it on tape, and we just spread the word. It's just amazing.
So Jeannie,
Yes.
I've got a question for you.
Uh-huh.
Is that feedback coming from me? Sorry. So here's the question. I heard you in your presentation say that some of the descendants of the enslaved did have their DNA tested. Now, you don't have to answer this. Let me put that out there first. Did there in these findings, did they find any commonality or any DNA contributed by enslavers?
Well, some of you out there speak up, because I believe so. Yes.
I think she don't give it, only can give input if she types it in.
Yeah. There's Briscoes and people that are descendants that are from enslaved and from the slaveholder. Yes. Now,
Okay.
that is related some way or another. It's big families, so we don't have the well-documented Sally Hemings story at Sotterley. I don't have, that is a well-documented story from way back when. But yes, I'll say the answer is yes.
Okay. So guys, we have about 15 minutes or so left. So I just want to try to get through the rest of these questions. I want to make sure everybody's question gets answered. So I'm going to group two questions together because I think they're connected here. So it is the following. What do you say to a nonprofit that cancels a field trip for its student group because several adult mentors feel the kids should not go into an historic house previously owned by a man who enslaved his workers?
Oh, I think that works a lot of ways. I was a part of an experience in Virginia. Ben Lamone. I left South Carolina thinking that I was going to be addressing some school children at the site, and I get there and found out that it wasn't going to happen because the kids have to get these permission slips to come to these places and experience these places. And the fact that they were going to be talking about slavery on that day, some parents objected. And this is years ago. This is like maybe 7-ish years ago, way before now, these times that we're dealing with now, where folks, some folks don't want this history being interpreted to young minds. And this was a time before that. So there are various ways that this concept of this idea can be applied. I was once a part of a Boy Scout troop, assisting a Boy Scout troop, and the leaders we share DNA. I mean, we're all Black. It's a majority Black unit of Boy Scouts, and I suggested going to a plantation, and the leader said, "No, we're not going to a plantation." Now, of course, he's the leader. He makes the calls, but the thing is, we kind of force our way of thinking, our thought process on the younger minds, thinking that they can't handle it. So we've got to be careful there. So I'll put a period right there and see if there's any other input there.
Yeah, that takes time too. We've had to meet with parents beforehand because we're teaching maybe second graders, and I had one mother confide in me. I just wanted him to stay, in innocence just a little while longer. It was really heartbreaking to hear her say that, but I wanted to protect her child. And it's, it, and I approve, I think parents should ask all the questions they need to. And I encourage visits beforehand if the parents want to come, or they want to come at some other time and come and see our place. That's great, because that's a trust thing. I mean, they're trusting their children to us, but we do it age appropriately. We're talking more about perspective of other children that were enslaved at Solderly. Like we tell a story about uh, uh, one of the Kane children that would have helped at the schoolhouse for the Briscoe children and white wealthy relatives and girls, and standing outside waiting to bring in the firewood or get the water or whatever his tasks may be that day. But the question is, what is George doing out there while he's waiting? And get answers from what do you think he's doing out there? Well, he's listening, he's learning, and it's a chance to share with the children that people learn in different ways. They don't actually have to be in a formal classroom to learn something. He's taking all this knowledge back and practicing his letters back at the quarter. And so we do it age appropriately too. We have different levels of and we follow the curriculum. We have a good curriculum at our public school, so we have good standards and things we have to meet, and it's all it's all a process. You layer it on. It's just like when you read a Bible verse as a kid and you read it again 30 years later, and it says something else to you, right? There's another layer on there, right? And that's how it's done. And I've had a parent one time turn to me once while the kids were doing an activity, and she said, "So why should we be here? Why should we be learning this? I mean, this is questions I get." And so these kinds of and I was happy she said that, because it says she is trusting me with an answer that I'm going to answer. She feels comfortable enough around me to ask me those hard questions. So it's really kind of encouraging when people ask those hard questions.
And I think you probably answered Justin's question here, where it says, how do you navigate the compounded fear of loss of power or control when it comes to K through 12 education, parents resisting not only inclusive narratives themselves, but resisting their children even being exposed to it? And how can we fulfill our responsibility to students despite some parents' objections?
Well, I think part of the answer is what we're doing right now. If those parents don't take away their devices, those kids will have access. And we've got their ears also. I think we should compete for their attention just as much as those who are against what we do compete for their attention. One threat to this is that there's this new media creation by Donald Trump, that's going to come into existence. I think it already is in existence. So that has to be countered. That there's got to be some pushback to that. The electronic means and this infrastructure, Build Back Better, they're giving more people access to more broadband, to more Wi-Fi. That's good and bad, because I think some of the places, most of the places that the Wi-Fi is not right now is in those rural areas. And it is in those rural areas that these ideas are born of, not teaching children real history. So there's we've got to be on our toes, and we've got to vie for the ears of these young folks who are impressionable. And these young folks who are impressionable have the means of accessing information just as we're accessing information right now. So we've got to compete.
True. Okay, next question I have here is, what are reliable or common signs in the discussion that someone is not open to being convinced or persuaded or educated? And how do you gracefully exit or close the discussion?
I don't. Yeah.
Let everybody talk at once.
Well, I don't know that discussions is always closed. Because I always think there's hope. I spar with people. I don't mind instigating and being the aggressor and starting the discussion. And I don't walk away from the discussion. I welcome the discussion. I welcome discussions, and I'm more comfortable if that discussion can be a public forum, just as just like right now, we're over, let's say 822, and we still got 65 people strong, still listening in. Now, that's impressive. That's so I don't ever think the discussion is closed. We may go back and forth out in public, and I think that's a good thing, to have these kinds of discussions. On my Facebook page, I go back and forth with some folks, and folks say, I should unfriend these folks. No, I don't think I should, because Jeannie said it in her presentation that you got to be persistent. You got to understand that there's going to be pushback to this. But I think it is that pushback that inspires me to move forward with the message. So there will be those folks who are not going to accept what you're selling. They're not going to buy what you're selling, but you don't have to quit selling it. I think that should give you inspiration to sell on, move on, and maybe someday you can convince this person to come over to your side and into your camp.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I always say that you can't really fight, not really. You can't really address and fight what you don't understand. So you have to be open to hearing it. You can't. I don't block anyone because I need to know it. Everything I need to know what you have to address. Okay. Next question that I have here is, I'm gonna, well, since this was an event too that Howard County, I'm gonna jump to a Howard County response, or something that was said here in the conversation. And it's actually, I don't know if it's actually a question, but I'm going to read it anyway. It says, in Howard County, Black parents didn't want their kids going to Virginia or Thomas Jefferson's, didn't want their kids to send a signal of acceptance of Thomas Jefferson. One has to admit that whites would marketed such a visit. I'm not sure I understand what that means. One has to admit that whites would marketed such a visit as the latter.
Is this Thomas Jefferson a school, or Thomas Jefferson's Monticello?
Doesn't say in here. Maybe the person will say again and come back and speak to further what they were meaning. And then there is a question that was in the chat, a very early on question about what have been some of the challenges in Howard County. Do they help or harm, and how? And I guess that I would like to answer that question by saying, one of the things that I've learned throughout this process and engaging with other people that are also in the trenches, I'll just say, with having to deal with hard history, is what some people refer to it as, is that sometimes it isn't helpful. In fact, a lot of times it isn't helpful to have the person that you are trying to engage with feel attacked. It's very easy, I think, for people to feel, very easy, in fact, for people who are comfortable, people who are, again, the people who have always had the microphones, for them to feel very comfortable and then therefore to feel challenged. Whether or not the person is actually posing it as a challenge, as a direct challenge, is kind of irrelevant. It's how the person ends up feeling that they are challenged, simply because I think a lot of times they have had the microphones and no one has, they've just had it sometimes by de facto power or installed power. But then when the new kid comes on the block, then I think that there's always going to be this issue of resistance, and then people wondering, what are you really here for, and concerned about their power. I might say that after this presentation, there are lots of things that I remember, and I probably will remember after this day, that Jeannie has said in her presentation. But I think one of the ones that I think that I'm going to personally carry with me throughout everything that I do from now on in Howard County is the concept of wearing it as a badge. And and the other thing that Jeannie said is that if you're not, I think that Paul Newman has some quote, something like that too, that if you're not, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, and I know he didn't say if you're not pissing somebody off, but he said something else. But if you're not nobody likes the thought of making enemies, but I think that, sometimes people can just present themselves where they're so resistant to you that they feel like to you that they are, that they're your enemy, when really all it is just the person is just scared sometimes, or they just don't want to share. And then it shouldn't stop you, or just can't let it stop you from doing the work. You wear your badge, you get up another day, and you realize that, you do what you can and everything. So I don't want to call out, therefore, because I don't find it helpful. I think that for us in Howard County, and maybe there are lots of other people on this presentation who feel the same way, and that is, you just concentrate on doing the work. And if your work is impeccable, if your work is good, understand that, yes, if you're doing your work differently than how other people are doing their work, you will be challenged, because you are upsetting the status quo. And sometimes the status quo has been work that has not been as comprehensive as it should have been. And then so when a new kid comes on the block and then provides that information and does it and makes their work impeccable, because they know that it needs to be impeccable to be able to survive, first of all, everything, you just take it with a grain of salt and understand that you will have the resistance. So that's how I'm going to answer that question about Howard County. And then I think we'll maybe have one more time for one more thing. Let's see. It says, how does a site address the continuation of a historic site with plantation in their title and the stigma that is carried with it?
Well, I actually like the word plantation, but let me try to break that down. So, sometimes if you ask a person if they visited a plantation, they may say no, but then you ask that person that same question differently, have you ever visited Monticello, Montpelier, the Hermitage, Mount Vernon? If they say yes, then they've visited plantations. Well, those are sites of former presidents, 12 of our former presidents were slave owners. So there was this concerted effort to take plantation away from that name that these places are called, in that effort to hide our history, hide real history of what went on in those places. So I actually think plantations are quite proper in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, we are at 8:30, the bewitching hour, everything. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank the presenters, the co-presenters here. I want to very much thank Jeannie.
Thank you.
Thank you so
My
much for agreeing to do this. Joe, thank you for gracing us with your presence. Yeah, if anybody has any ideas, look us up online, and each of us online, if you know of any kind of groups that Facebook groups or something that discuss this topic about, because I'd like to join a tribe. So if there's other people who want to too, let's start a tribe somewhere and everything, so we can be talking about these things and continuing the conversation. But thank you all for joining us this evening, and be well. Happy holidays, Happy New Year, and wear your badges.
On behalf of the Slave Dwelling Project, Historic Souderly, and the Howard County Lynching Project, thank y'all. You will be receiving a recording of this. You will also be receiving an email that will provide you with the links to Jeannie's presentation, as well as a video from the descendants that chatted at the Slave Dwelling Conference as well. Please continue to follow all three organizations. Please feel free to reach out to our presenters. We thank you once again, and have a good night.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.